I want to talk now about a project or experiment which developed accidentally, and I want to explain the accidents that occurred on the way, but has produced, I think, a very unusual and large set of film interviews of interesting people, which is unique in some ways. It started, I suppose, as all these things do, a long time ago, and there were a set of features about my own life which I think fed into this, as with my other projects. One was obviously that I became trained as an anthropologist. Anthropologists use various tools, and one of them is the life history, life story, which they elicit from their informants. And this is a very powerful biographical tool, which is sometimes done just through talking and noting, but sometimes through tape recording and less frequently through filming. So when I was trained as an anthropologist and I went out to Nepal in 1968, I imagined that I would get to know one or two people well and note down or even perhaps tape record their lives, which I started to do. And this was a technique which, having done it in my fieldwork then, I continued to do through different bits of fieldwork through later life, and in particular when I got to know my adopted sister Lil Maya very well. In 1992 I did a series of 10 20-minute interviews with her about her life in a Himalayan village, and I interviewed others. So this was a normal sort of thing to do for an anthropologist, but it wasn't so normal for historians. Most historians deal with dead people, documents. There were, of course, a few who were interested, particularly in the 60s, 70s, in oral history, as it was called, and they took their techniques, in fact, from anthropologists and recorded old people talking about their lives. But this was much less useful, or rather usual, and I certainly hadn't learnt it as a 17th century historian. So that's one influence. The second must be even deeper, which is my own family. My grandmother was a great storyteller, and from my childhood onwards I was hearing about her exploits in Burma and India and elsewhere. And my mother also was a good narrator, and in her written works, in her letters and in her stories when she came back from India, I would pick up bits and pieces about her life. And so I was interested in that. When I went to Oxford, I began to get more interested. I started to listen to older academics. It was clear that I was entering a world of an oral history which I didn't know anything much about, and I really became intrigued by listening to older historians in particular, and in particular Lady Rosalind Clay, who taught me in my second, third years as an undergraduate and became a friend. And for some years I used to go to her house and listen to her talk, and she was related to many of the famous Oxford families, the Mitfords, the Mitchisons. Her father was a master of Balliol, her husband was a famous economist. She knew all the gossip of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and I really lapped this up. And there were others. I began, particularly in my PhD years, to hang out with the social anthropologists because I was studying witchcraft and I knew they had worked on that. So I used to go to their famous pubs and go for walks with them, and in particular Evans Pritchard, who became my examiner, who influenced me a lot, was an inveterate storyteller, gossip, and I began to pick up the memories from him of anthropology in the 30s, 40s, 50s, his encounters with Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown and so on. So from two different disciplines I was learning the interest of oral history of academic life. By chance I then went on to the London School of Economics, and when I arrived there there were a generation who were soon to retire, but clearly carried the great days of structural functional anthropology in their minds. Raymond Firth, Lucy Mayer, Isaac Shapiro, my supervisor, and a number of others. So again, I listened to their memories and histories. And when I went on to the School of Oriental and African Studies to do a PhD in anthropology, the same thing happened. I listened to the stories, particularly of my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, of the great days of Austrian and British anthropology. Adrian Mayer and older anthropologists told me and filled me in on the stories. All this was particularly important because I was coming into a new discipline, a small discipline where I had to learn the craft methods, and one of the best ways, obviously, was to talk to practitioners about what they had done, how they had discovered things. So I really learnt a great deal in observing and listening to them. And the same thing happened when I came to Cambridge in a double way. Firstly, within the Department of Social Anthropology, as I joined the edges of it and then became a member of it, there was again a great generation of anthropologists, Edmund Leach, Stanley Tambaya, Jack Goody, Esther Goody, G.I. Jones and others, who took me back into the heyday of Cambridge anthropology, and of course Audrey Richards, Maya Fortes, of an earlier period. And again I learnt from them and from people in King's, because here I was introduced to elderly fellows who were remembering the days of even the Bloomsbury group. There was Dady Rylands, one of the last members of the Bloomsbury group in King's. There was Richard Braithwaite, who told me the story of Wittgenstein's poker and the great days of philosophy. There were all sorts of people who filled me in on the oral history of King's College and Cambridge. So all this fed my imagination and gave me an interest. The other area that gave me an interest was that even at school, and certainly as an undergraduate in my first term, I was taught that I should learn from the methods and lives of great predecessors. We, in the first term, studied Gibbon, Macaulay, de Tocqueville, Bede, and looked at their lives and their works. And this continued through my time as a historian. And later in my life, I wrote books and became interested in great figures like Montesquieu and de Tocqueville and Adam Smith and others, and wrote about them, realizing that studying their lives and how they worked could improve my own efforts. There was yet one further influence of a general kind, and that was that as I pursued the new kind of social history, the history of mentalities and ordinary people in the past, not just high-level politics, I realized that one of the very best sources for all of this was personal biographical detail coming from letters, diaries, autobiographies, all sorts of things like that. And so I decided that I would make a study. My first book was a study of Ralph Jocelyn, a 17th century clergyman, and I wrote The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn about his diary and published an edition with Sarah Harrison of the diary later. And I started to collect diaries, letters, autobiographies of that and that kind of material, realizing how valuable it was. So all this led up to a situation where in 1975, when I joined the Department of Social Anthropology, I was alert to the importance and interest in biographical approaches. And then it was joined with technology, because the Audiovisual Aids Unit in Cambridge, run by Martin Genke and David Herworth, I became friends with them, and I began to see the value and power of their studio and their cameras. And so when in 1976 I was asked to run a series of seminars on history and anthropology for the SSRC, as it was then called, the Social Science Research Council, and invited to bring in who I would like, I thought, well, if I'm going to invite great people I've long admired and have a chance to listen to them in a seminar setting, over a number of days in Cambridge. Why not record all this? Seemed an obvious idea. So with Martin Genke and his crew, we set up cameras round the table and we recorded several of the sessions. And we captured, for the future, as I could see it, great figures who were in their prime, like Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, Maurice Godelier, Edmund Leach, Jack Goody, Arnaldo Momeliano, and others. And then the next generation who were just coming up, Keith Thomas, Keith Hopkins, Maurice Bloch, Joel Kahn, and others, Peter Burke. And one could see that this would be very valuable in 20, 30 years when some of these people would have passed on and some of them would be major international figures. So we kept the tapes. And I expected lots of people to do the same thing, but I don't think many people did. The only other example I have of it really is something which I did, partly influenced by that, in 1999, when I was doing a television series and we set it round a group of 5 academics round a table in King's discussing the history of the world over the last 10,000 years, which I'll talk about elsewhere. Anyway, nothing then particularly happened until 1982, when Jack Goody was about to retire, and he, working with Stephen Levinson, the linguist, and perhaps a linguist would be interested in recording these things, they worked again with the Audiovisual Aids Unit to record 3 elderly colleagues of Jack Goody's, M.N. Srinivas, Audrey Richards and Maya Fortes, giving talks or seminars in a studio or in a lecture room about their lives and works. And then Jack retired. That was 1982. And then about that time, 1982-3, I set up the Rivers Video Project, which was the idea of buying a camera, working with undergraduates and graduate students of mine to see what we could do with film. So one of them, Tristram Riley Smith, did a film of Hodgson, the great anthropologist and linguist of Nepal. Sofka Zinoviev did a film of kings. A group of them made a film about Malthus, and they recorded my kinship lectures. That's all 1982-3. And the wonder of this was that you could, with this pneumatic camera, you could get out of the studio. The tapes were much cheaper and you could do it yourself. So in June 1983, I thought, why not try this out on a particular anthropologist, namely my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf. So we did a long interview, up to 2 hours, where we went through his life and he talked and he explained all the films, which I didn't really know about, that he'd made, and the people he'd known and who had influenced him. And this was really a revelation, that particular interview. And it was fortunately followed up a month later by a meeting, the decennial meeting of the Association of Social Anthropologists in Cambridge, where international figures like the Firths, Raymond Firth and his wife, S.J. Tambaya, Mary Douglas, all sorts of people came to Cambridge. And so I set up a camera and we filmed shortish interviews, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, of about 10 or so people who came to that conference who otherwise I wouldn't have been able to get. Unfortunately, the camera and the sound were not good, but we have little portraits of a number of people. With that and with this camera, I began to see that one could do something more. I was still hesitant about my own abilities to interview people. So if possible, I would get someone who knew the elderly, usually anthropologist, to interview them. And Jack Goody was very helpful here. He interviewed Jean Lafontaine, John Barnes, and Jean Lafontaine interviewed Lucy Mayer, Caroline Humphrey interviewed Owen Lattimore. We began to build this up slowly, an interview or 2 a year. So by the end of the 80s, there were perhaps 15 or so interviews of interesting anthropologists, nearly all anthropologists or sociologists on the border of anthropology. Then in the 90s I continued. The cameras got better, it became easier, and so I did a few more, and perhaps the odd historian and people on the branches on the side of anthropology. But the difficulty was that you couldn't really do anything with this material. It piled up in a heap in my cupboard in the department, but these pneumatic tapes were really not viewable in an easy way, and anyway, who was interested? You couldn't really force it on anyone. I showed it to a few groups of students, and that was about it. Difficult to make copies, it was difficult, almost impossible to edit. And so basically by the end of the 20th century, I had about perhaps 20-25 interviews I'd made. And so it went on until about 2003-04. Then everything changed. Firstly, the technology for holding the material and editing it and digitizing it, because before it had been analog, was altered by the arrival of new media, new hard disks, the internet, edit suites, all sorts of things which suddenly made it, and new cameras, which suddenly made it possible to do things you hadn't thought were possible and weren't possible 10 years or 5 years before. So that's from the beginning of the 21st century. And then in 2004, or perhaps 2003, the university, in collaboration with other universities, set up Digital Space, DSpace, which was going to be a digital repository for the university and the library. And they came and visited us and said, you know, what could you use this repository for? And Mark Turin, with whom I was now beginning to work on digital things, suggested, sensibly, why not start with the Ancestor interviews, as I called them. That time, and I just checked, I probably had about 35 to 40 interviews which could be put up onto DSpace, and so in June 2004 these interviews went up. As they went up, we had the idea that it would be useful to not only have the interviews but have a summary, not a transcript but a detailed summary of what people were talking about. This would be helpful for people to search which bit of the interview they wanted to watch, because it would have some of the time codes on them, and it would be also indexed by Google, which was coming along at that time. And so Sarah Harrison began what became a huge amount of work doing detailed summaries of the interviews as they were made, and which are all up on the web. So there were 35, 40. Now that you could put them up and they could go all over the world, it became much more exciting, because someone who wanted to see some interview you'd done could watch it in Australia, America, anywhere. And they began to be downloaded, they began to be copied. People would make a whole set of copies of them for different countries and so on. So from 2004 I began to do more, and broadened out a bit. I would do more historians, a few sociologists, but they were still really in history, sociology and anthropology. Then in 2007 I was talking about what I was doing to some of my friends in King's College, and particularly to Pat Bateson, the recently retired provost, and or perhaps he was still provost then, and Herbert Huppert and Gabriel Horn, all very distinguished scientists, and they all said, that sounds most exciting, Alan, why don't you do scientists? So I of course said, A, because I don't know anything about science and how can I ask them any sensible questions, and B, surely lots of people are doing it already, because science is such a much more important and bigger set of subjects than just anthropology or sociology. perhaps not more important, but certainly bigger. And they said, no, you can ask the questions. Perhaps will be an advantage that you don't know too much about their subjects. They'll be frank and open, and they'll have to come to your level. And no, as far as we know, no one is doing this. Turned out later that there was a project in Sussex. A physics Nobel Prize winner had set up a project, and they had done a few, but not many, and they were much more formal about the work in a sort of formal setting, not life so much, and there weren't many. And in America they'd done a big project on those who were behind the developments in biological sciences leading up to the discovery of DNA. But they were mostly tape recordings and not video interviews, so there was very little. So with some trepidation I said, well, who shall I start with? And they said, well, how about Dan Mackenzie? He's been a roommate of yours for some years. He's a lively man, and I think he would be fun. So in May of 2007 I did an interview with Dan, the discoverer of tectonic plates, co-discoverer of tectonic plates, and it was lovely. He was very open and it went easily. And I reported this, and about the same time Pat Bateson said, well, why don't I do an interview with Gabriel Horn, who's an old friend, very distinguished, and I've worked with him. So he did a 2-hour interview with Gabriel, which went very well, and I filmed. And this led to, there were 3 people, Gabriel, Pat and Robert Hind, all working on the intersection of the biological, zoological sciences. And so I then did a long interview with each of them. I did the one with Robert Hind and with Pat Bateson, and then I did one filming Pat and Gabriel talking together. So you had about 10 hours of this seminal group talking about the development of biological and zoological sciences in Cambridge in the second half of the 20th century. Simultaneously, Pat, Herbert Huppert, Gabriel and 1 or 2 others were suggesting other scientists I should do. And so I started from that period over the next 3 years to really very rapidly do a number of interviews of very important, interesting scientists. In 1 week, for instance, I did Sidney Brenner, the Nobel Prize winner, I did Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, and I did Fred Sanger, the only double Nobel Prize winner now living. And there were other great weeks as well. And so it rose from 40, 50 interviews by that time through to the end of my time as a university professor, my retirement towards the end of 2009. I'd done about 170, 80 interviews. And of course, if you're doing sciences, if you broadened it that way, there's a lot in between anthropology and the sciences. So I started to do musicians, literary critics, economists, even the odd civil servant, lawyer, and others. And they proved to be such fun, and I learnt so much about other worlds that I really enjoyed this period. And I got help from people who could interview in America or Norway or India or elsewhere. So there were a dozen or so other interviews done by friends and colleagues. Now, this brings me to the final point, which is really why is one doing this? It's partly been indicated from my early experiences and what I was interested in, the idea of learning the craft of a discipline from talking to older members of that discipline who've perfected it. And one can extend that to a lifelong interest I've had in how one works best. How does one arrange one's life? What does one do to bring out the best of one's mind and personality into one's work? So all the interviews, if possible, probed a little into how a person worked. Do you have your ideas on walks? Do you listen to music? Are you influenced by your political or social? What is the effect of your parents and your family? What are the networks of friends who've contributed? Do you work alone or with people? So on. The whole background to creativity, which a number of people have studied in books and articles, I thought could be explored through looking at the lives of a number of really successful, distinguished people, from Anthony Gormley through the Lord Chief Justice to John Rutter, the musician, to George Steiner, the literary critic, to Nobel Prize winners in science and others. So there was that. There was also the inner history of disciplines, which is not recorded usually, but who influenced who, what happened then, what were the background to the setting up of new subdisciplines and so on. So the microhistory of various tribes, as I thought of them. Anthropology was a small tribe, and there were bigger tribes of molecular biologists or whatever it was. And so this history of particularly King's College, more generally Cambridge, more generally British, and more generally world academic intellectual history of the later 20th century into the 21st century is recorded and available. And it's up on various forms. It's up on my website. It's up on DSpace, on the streaming media service. It's copied around the world. It's going up in China in various websites. And it's up increasingly on YouTube and other sites like that. So people can enjoy it, and hopefully it's preserved for posterity. And it's all a gigantic but pleasurable accident. Perhaps I should just add one final word, which is about the way I do these interviews. I found that the less paraphernalia one had, the less intimidating. Therefore, I just have a camera, no tripod or lighting or anything like that. I did realise that the sound was very bad in some of the interviews, and so a rifle mic or an attached microphone is important. But the main thing was to make sure that the person felt relaxed, so I would have a lunch with them before and talk to them generally, but not ask them any of the questions. I found that it was best, in fact, if I knew very little about the person, and if I did know a good deal, I concealed that, because I was interviewing for a general public who wouldn't know anything, and therefore it turned out that it was a great advantage that in many of the interviews I knew nothing about them. It's more difficult when I did know something about them, because one could easily get into jargon or take things for granted. The format was chronological, starting with grandparents, family, history, anything they wanted to talk about that, because that is very shaping, the social background, where a person has come from, and then parents, as much as they'd like to talk about them and their influence, then particularly their childhood, early experiences, early hobbies, schooling, up to university. And often the first hour of a 2-hour interview would take a person through their early years and up to university. This not only revealed a great deal about them, because they were talking about it indirectly, it also won the confidence, and often people hadn't talked about these things to anyone. So you got inside them through this process. So it was a very important aspect of the interviews, the background, and indeed great fun to learn something about them as human beings before they became professionals with a public face. Then, of course, universities, their doctoral research, if they did that, their teaching, and so on. And then in the last section, I'd talk about their particular achievements, their books, their experiments, what they thought was important about their lives, and how they worked. There were a checklist of things I always wanted to cover: religion, music and hobbies, politics, and so on. But basically I let them talk as they wanted to. I would just let them talk, and then if they stopped, I would then ask a question. So it was what I call my sheepdog approach. In other words, I just lay there waiting while they moved along, and then if they needed a little bit of guiding or encouragement, I would give it. This was evolved over time. At the beginning I had sort of set questions and it was more formal, but I found that the more relaxed I was and confident and just there to listen, basically, the better. I'll now just give a few examples from the history of this, showing the evolution through just one or two very short extracts from interviews of what we have done.
On your paper, but because I'm really talking about something rather different. But the questions, what, why and how, are very often not the questions in one's own historical work. One is asking so much as who and whom. And I think one has to put those questions together with your questions. I put them back at Gelner too. I mean, he tells us with some confidence that he knows there are three causes, which are economic, coercive and ideological.
Well, Bill Epstein came to see me about a fortnight ago and said, how is it that you people in the 30s collected so much more material than any of us do nowadays? I don't know if that's true. If so, why is it true?
In that there are quite a number of photographs. I also actually collected some of the smaller sculptures, not taking them out of the men's houses, which I think would have been quite wrong even if one could have done that. But I got the same artist to carve for me. Some of them are in the Museum of Anthropology, Völkerkunde Museum in Vienna.
After Harvard, I worked a little while at MIT in the Center for National Studies, and went back to Indonesia to do a study of, that's when I got caught in that war I was just talking about. And ended up with a year in Bali. It was originally planned to be 3 different places, but that didn't turn out to be practical. So then I came back and spent a year at Palo Alto at that think tank there, and had a job at Berkeley, and went and taught at Berkeley for a year.
I never turned to religion. I was really true to myself. I never, although knowing that I might very well die, I never actually felt, this is the moment I better get myself converted to Judaism properly or something like that. Yeah. And never actually crossed my mind. And I've always thought, well, I hope that if on my deathbed I do something funny like that, everyone will understand that it doesn't mean anything at all, that it's just that's absolutely right. But that didn't happen at all.
And did you find it a very good place to teach? I mean, apart from the language, were the students good and the other...
Not as brilliant as they would have been here or at Harvard. Very mixed, but at the graduate level, absolutely international. And a city in which itself 4 or 5 languages are completely current and perfect for comparative literature. Right, I mean, tailor-made for that kind of vision of literature. And the center of Europe. Weekend, I'd be in Milan, down the road through the tunnel. I'd be in Paris. I'd be in Munich constantly, teaching, lecturing, drawing. It's a central point. There wasn't yet the Eurostar, remember?
And where were you born?
Rincon, that's a village in the Cotswolds. My family lived there. My father was a doctor.
Yes.
And he had a practice in Rincon.
Did your mother have a job?
No, she didn't.
She just lived there. And
she lived there. She came from a fairly wealthy family, and she had the money. And she really never did any sort of cooking or housekeeping or anything.